When Hans Müller stepped off the train in California as a German prisoner of war, he expected chains, cruelty, and slow starvation. Everything the Reich had promised awaited captured soldiers in America. Instead, a farmer handed him a fresh orange, and the scent of it broke him completely. What happened next would change not just one man's life, but the course of reconciliation between two nations. November 1943, California. The train screeched to a halt in the Salinas Valley, and 28-year-old Hans Müller pressed his face against the bars of the cattle car. What he saw made no sense. Green. Everywhere, green. Rolling fields stretched toward distant mountains. The air that slipped through the gaps carried the scent of citrus blossoms. For 3 months, he had prepared himself for desert wasteland, for brutality disguised as justice, for the erasure of dignity that awaited captured men in America. But this looked like paradise. Hans had been a schoolteacher once, in a quiet Bavarian village where children learned mathematics beneath wooden beams. Captured near Tunis with what remained of the Africa Corps, he had spent weeks in transit, cramped with ships and railway cars, each mile pulling him farther from everything he knew. America would work them until they collapsed. America would strip them of names and replace them with numbers. America, the propaganda posters had promised, was a nation of criminals and corruption. Yet here, as the train doors groaned open, Hans saw abundance that defied every warning. The guards who met them weren't screaming. They stood in loose clusters, sipping coffee from tin cups. One of them yawned, no chains rattled, no dogs barked. Hans climbed down carefully. The sun pressed warmth into his shoulders, a sensation so foreign after months of cold holds and concrete floors. Around him, other prisoners descended in silence, their faces tight with confusion. Then he saw them. The groves. Row after row of trees stretched across the valley floor, their branches heavy with fruit that gleamed like small suns. Hans had never seen an orange tree before. A guard gestured toward a waiting truck. "Let's go, fellas. Camp's 10 miles that way." Hans climbed aboard, his mind reeling. He had been taught to fear monsters. Instead, he found a land so rich it seemed to mock everything he had been told about American weakness. As the truck rolled forward, he turned back to stare at the groves disappearing behind him, and for the first time since capture, he felt a flicker he hadn't expected. Hope. The posters had shown skeletal figures in striped rags, hollow eyes staring from behind barbed wire. Hans could still see them in his mind, plastered across every barracks wall in North Africa. Captions warning that capture meant slow suffering at the hands of a nation without honor. Radio broadcasts described America as a land built on greed. During evening roll calls, officers assured them that surrender was not an option. Better to fight to the last breath than endure what awaited in enemy hands. The officers spoke with such certainty. The pamphlets were printed on official paper. The journey across the Atlantic had only deepened his dread. Packed into the hold of a Liberty ship with 200 other prisoners, Hans spent 17 days in near darkness. Some said Americans would send them to work in coal mines until their lungs gave out. Others claimed they would build the very bombs that would strike their homeland. Hans knew fear. It sat in his chest like a stone. But California refused to cooperate with his expectations. The abundance was the first crack in the narrative. Fields, heavy with crops. Towns that looked intact, untouched by war. People going about their lives with a casualness that seemed impossible. Then came the guards who didn't shout, the lack of chains, the warm air that smelled of growing things instead of gunpowder. As the truck rolled through Salinas toward the camp, Hans pressed his face closer to the wooden slats and saw a sight that shattered the first lie completely. A farmhouse stood near the road, white paint gleaming. In the yard, 3 children played, their laughter carrying over the rumble of the engine. When they noticed the truck, they didn't run. They waved, not with hatred but with curiosity, the way children everywhere greet anything unfamiliar. Hans lifted his hand without thinking and waved back. The girl grinned. And in that instant, sitting in a prisoner transport truck thousands of miles from home, Hans understood that everything he had been told was a lie. The doctor's hands were surprisingly gentle. Hans stood in his underclothes in a makeshift examination room, one of 30 wooden structures hastily built on former farmland just outside Salinas. California had become home to more than 20,000 German and Italian prisoners. The reason was simple. With millions of young American men serving overseas, California's agricultural empire was bleeding workers. Prisoners filled the gap. "Open your mouth," the doctor said through a translator, shining a small light. He checked Hans's teeth, his lungs, his feet. When he found an infected blister on Hans's heel, he cleaned it, applied ointment, and bandaged it carefully. "You'll want to keep that dry," he said, not unkindly. "Why tend to the wounds of an enemy?" The processing continued. A clerk recorded his name, rank, and hometown. Another issued him 2 sets of work clothes, denim trousers and cotton shirts with the letters "Prisoner of War" stenciled on the back. Not a uniform. Not prison stripes. Just clothes. Walking through Camp Salinas for the first time, Hans kept expecting the facade to crack. The fence was chain link, barely 10 feet tall. The only weapons visible were the sidearms holstered loosely on the guards' belts. No towers. No searchlights. The barracks held 30 men each, double-bunked but spacious. Down the row, a mess hall, a library, a chapel, a recreation field. That first evening, Hans sat at a long wooden table in the mess hall, staring at his tray. Eggs scrambled with cheese, toast with butter, real coffee. Around him, other men ate in stunned silence. One prisoner whispered that the food must be poisoned. But morning came, and breakfast arrived again. Just as much. Just as real. Later, alone in his bunk, Hans pulled out the small diary he'd managed to keep hidden through capture and transport. By dim lamplight, he wrote in careful script, "Either this is an elaborate deception or everything I believed about the enemy was a lie. I do not yet know which frightens me more." The morning they were assigned to the Martinez orange grove, Hans Miller had no idea his understanding of mercy was about to be rewritten. The truck rumbled down a dirt road flanked by rows of trees, their branches heavy with fruit. Hans sat on the wooden bench beside 11 other prisoners. None of them had worked in an orchard before. They were still prisoners. This was still the enemy's land. When the truck stopped, a man was waiting. Thomas Martinez stood at the edge of his grove, 50-some years old, his face weathered by decades under the California sun. He wore denim overalls. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. He simply nodded as the guard opened the tailgate. "Morning," Martinez said, his voice low and even. "You'll be picking today. I'll show you how." Through a translator, he explained the work. Climb the ladder carefully. Twist the fruit gently so the stem breaks clean. Place each orange in the canvas sack without bruising. Martinez demonstrated on one tree, his movements efficient and practiced, then stepped back and watched as the prisoners began. Hans took a ladder and positioned it against a tree thick with fruit. Climbing slowly, he reached for an orange and pulled. It came away easily, the weight of it solid in his palm. The skin was bright, nearly glowing. By mid-morning, the sun had climbed high. Sweat trickled down his back. Then Martinez called out, "Break time!" The prisoners climbed down and gathered near the truck. Martinez walked over carrying 2 wooden crates filled with freshly picked oranges. Setting them down, he gestured, "Help yourselves." Hans hesitated, then picked up an orange. It was cool despite the heat. Bringing it close to his face, without thinking, he inhaled. The scent hit him like a wave. Sweet and sharp, bright, and impossibly clean. It bypassed thought entirely and went straight to memory. Suddenly, he was no longer standing in a California grove. He was 8 years old, sitting at his mother's kitchen table on Christmas morning, 1938. She was peeling an orange, the only one they could afford that year, her fingers working carefully to preserve every section. The scent had filled the small room, mingling with pine from the tree in the corner. She had handed him a piece, smiling, and he had closed his eyes to make the sweetness last. Oranges in Germany were treasures, rare luxuries saved for holidays. And now, standing in an enemy's field, Hans held one freely given, and the memory of his mother's hands overwhelmed him. Tears came without warning. Quietly at first, then harder, his shoulders shaking. Turning away, ashamed, but it was too late. Around him, other men were crying too. They all remembered. Martinez stood a few feet away, his hat in his hands. He said nothing. He simply nodded, once, slowly. For the first time since capture, Hans tasted sweetness that wasn't ration chocolate or stolen sugar. It tasted like home. It tasted like mercy. Within 2 weeks, the German prisoners stopped working like prisoners and started working like farmhands. The men scattered among the trees. Martinez walked the rows throughout the morning, correcting when someone pulled too hard. He never shouted. He simply showed the right way. There was pride in doing work well, Hans discovered. When Hans filled his first bin without a single bruised orange, the farmer paused, inspected the fruit, and nodded once. "Good," he said in English. Hans didn't need a translator for that. The prisoners began competing among themselves. Who could pick the fastest without sacrificing quality? They kept informal tallies, teasing each other in German during breaks. The grove was never silent. Mexican braceros worked alongside the Germans. Local teenagers came after school. Elderly farmers whose sons had gone to war worked slowly but steadily. Everyone side by side, united by the simple task of harvest. Hans picked up Spanish words. Naranja for orange. Más for more. In return, he taught a young bracero named Miguel to count in German. Eins, zwei, drei, Miguel repeated, laughing. Martinez's policy remained straightforward. During breaks, eat as much fruit as you want. Hans watched as prisoners who had grown up under rationing slowly adjusted to the idea that there would always be more. The trees kept producing. Then the letter arrived. Mid-December, during a mail call at camp, Hans received an envelope postmarked Bavaria. His sister's handwriting, shaky and rushed. He tore it open, hands trembling. The words were careful, censored, but their meaning clear. Allied bombing had intensified. Their village had been hit twice. Food rations had been cut again. Mother was ill, but couldn't get medicine. Father worked 16-hour shifts at a munitions plant. His sister asked if Hans was being treated well. Hans sat on his bunk that night, the letter heavy in his hands. Here he sat, eating oranges until his stomach ached, while his family starved and huddled in basements waiting for bombs. The guilt was crushing. The next morning, climbing the ladder felt different. Each orange reminded him of the one his mother couldn't afford. When Martinez noticed his silence and asked through the translator if he was unwell, Hans could only shake his head. That evening, Martinez found him sitting alone near the truck. The farmer sat down beside him. Then, through the translator, he spoke quietly. "You're thinking about home." Hans nodded. "My eldest boy is in Italy right now," Martinez continued. "Fighting your countrymen, probably. Every night I wonder if he's cold, if he's hungry, if he's scared." He paused, picked up a fallen orange. "I can't help him, can't protect him, can't even write him a letter that'll reach him in time to matter, but I can do this. I can make sure the men in front of me, enemy or not, go home to their families when this is over. Maybe someone over there is doing the same for my son." He stood, brushed dust from his overalls, and walked away without another word. Hans sat there as darkness fell, understanding a profound truth. In Germany, scarcity had ruled every decision, turning neighbor against neighbor. Here, generosity flowed freely, not from weakness but from abundance so vast it could be shared without fear. By December's end, Hans had stopped thinking of himself as a prisoner. He was a worker, and in the glow of California sunlight, that distinction mattered more than any political border. "You're all coming to dinner." Christmas Eve, 1943. The prisoners had expected to spend the night in their barracks. Instead, standing beside the truck at day's end, Martinez delivered an invitation that shocked everyone. Martinez had cleared it through the camp commander. 4 guards would accompany the men. No one strays from the property. Everyone back at camp by 10. When the truck pulled up to the Martinez home just after sunset, Hans could see lights glowing in every window. The house was modest, surrounded by orchards. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying the scent of roasting meat and baking bread. A Christmas tree stood visible through the front window, decorated with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. Rosa Martinez met them at the door, a small woman with dark hair pulled back. Behind her stood 3 daughters. An elderly woman, Martinez's mother, sat in a rocking chair near the fireplace. "Welcome," Rosa said through the translator. "You are far from home tonight. Here, you are guests." The dining table had been extended with boards and covered with white sheets. The meal was a vision from a dream. Roasted turkey, mashed potatoes whipped with butter, stuffing fragrant with sage, cranberry sauce, and at the center of the table a ceramic bowl piled high with oranges. Martinez bowed his head and said grace in Spanish. Rosa translated softly into English. One of the guards translated into German. The food was extraordinary, but what moved Hans more was the normalcy. The Martinez daughters giggled when their mother scolded them. For 2 hours, the war disappeared. After dinner, the youngest daughter sat at an upright piano and began to play. Christmas carols, simple and sweet. When she started Silent Night, Hans found himself singing in German without thinking. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Other prisoners joined, their voices tentative at first, then stronger. The languages blended, 3 versions of the same prayer for peace. Martinez stood and spoke through the translator. You did not choose this war. Neither did we. But tonight, we choose kindness. Hans reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden ornament he had carved in camp. A Christmas angel, her wings spread wide. Now he stood and offered it to Rosa. She took it with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Without a word, she walked to the tree and hung it on a prominent branch near the center. It would stay there for decades. That night, lying awake in his bunk, Hans realized the war had stolen more than his freedom. It had stolen his ability to see enemies as human. California was giving it back. The guitar string snapped with a sharp twang, and Miguel laughed. You're pressing too hard, Hans. Gentle, like picking oranges. Martinez had begun hosting evening gatherings at the farmhouse once a month. The prisoners who worked his grove were invited, along with the bracheros and local workers. Rosa served coffee and pastries. The men sat on the porch or in the yard, guitars appeared, and slowly walls came down. Miguel was teaching Hans to play. The guitar was old, its wood worn smooth. Miguel was patient, showing him where to press, how to strum. Within weeks, Hans could manage simple chords. Within months, he was playing along. The music itself became a language beyond words. German drinking songs met Mexican corridos, met American country ballads. Hans taught the group a folk tune from Bavaria. Miguel responded with a song his grandfather had sung, but not everyone embraced the new harmony. One evening in late March, a prisoner named Kurt Dietrich refused to join the circle. He stood apart, arms crossed, his face hard. Kurt had been a sergeant in the Africa Corps, a career soldier who still believed Germany would win. You forget who you are, Kurt said to Hans in harsh German. You play their music, eat their food, smile like dogs begging for scraps. When we return home, you'll be remembered as collaborators. The music stopped. Hans set down the guitar. I remember exactly who I am, he said quietly. I'm a man who was told to hate people I'd never met. I'm a teacher who believed lies. And now I'm learning that the enemy isn't who they told us it was. Kurt spat on the ground and walked away. Within a week, he was gone. The incident shook Hans. That night, unable to sleep, he walked to the edge of the barracks area. Martinez found him there. The farmer approached quietly and stood beside him. Finally, he spoke, forcing them to communicate in broken English and gestures. That man, Martinez said slowly, he is afraid. Hans nodded. Afraid of what? Afraid that if the enemy becomes your friend. Martinez made a gesture like walls falling. Then war has no meaning. Kurt wasn't angry at the kindness. He was terrified of it. One evening in early April, as the sun dropped low, Martinez's middle daughter asked Hans if he knew Lili Marleen. Every soldier knew that song. It had somehow crossed every border. Hans nodded and began playing the melody. Then he started singing in German. Vor der Kaserne, vor dem großen Tor. His voice cracked slightly. Before he reached the second verse, Martinez's daughter joined in, singing the English version. Underneath the lantern, by the barrack gate. Others picked up the tune, humming when they didn't know words, German and English and Spanish all blending under the California twilight. When the song ended, no one spoke. Then Martinez stood and looked out over his land. Through the translator, he spoke quietly. War makes men forget they're all made of the same dust. Hans felt the words settle somewhere deep. He thought about the propaganda, the certainty that the enemy was less than human. He thought about the children waving, about Rosa's tears, about Miguel's patience. And he realized a truth that would have been treason to speak months ago. He no longer wanted Germany to win the war. He wanted the war to end. The difference felt enormous. In the barracks, Hans had begun teaching English to other prisoners. Some learned eagerly, others resisted. But Hans knew better now. Whatever came next, the world would be different. In the glow of a California sunset, surrounded by music and laughter, Hans understood what propaganda could never teach. Humanity doesn't have borders. Only fear does. The radio crackled with static, then a voice broke through. Germany has surrendered. May 8th, 1945. Hans was in the Grove when he heard. The work crew had been called in early. The announcement was formal and solemn. The war in Europe was over. Berlin had fallen. Hitler was gone. For a long moment, no one moved. Over. The war was over. Hans felt his knees weaken, sitting down hard, his hands trembling. Around him, other prisoners reacted in scattered ways. One man laughed, another covered his face, a third just stared at nothing. Hans felt no joy. Only terror. Over meant going home, but home to what? His village lay in what would become the Soviet occupation zone. His parents had stopped writing. His sister's last letter had mentioned bombings, evacuation, and hunger. For months he had lived in a strange paradise. He had picked fruit while cities burned. He had laughed while his countrymen starved. And now he would have to face what remained. Martinez walked over and sat beside him. Finally, through the translator, he spoke quietly. I have a son, fighting in Italy. Or I did. I don't know if he's alive today. His voice was steady but strained. Every morning for 2 years, I've woken up wondering if today's the day the telegram comes. He paused, picked up a fallen orange. You can stay if you want. I'll hire you properly if they let me. I'll fight for it. You're the best worker I've had in 20 years, and more than that, you've become a friend. Hans looked at him, tears streaming. The offer was everything he wanted and nothing he could accept. Prisoners would be repatriated. Thank you, Hans managed in halting English. You are the best man I have known. You saved my life. More than life. You saved my soul. Martinez nodded once. You're a good man, Hans. Don't let anyone tell you differently. Within 2 weeks, the trucks began arriving. The farm work continued until the last possible day. Hans picked oranges with tears streaming, knowing each ladder climb might be his last. On his final morning, Martinez met him at the truck with 3 things. First, a wooden crate filled with oranges. Second, a letter of reference. Third, a photograph showing the Martinez family with Hans in the center, everyone smiling despite everything. So you don't forget, Martinez said simply. Hans tried to speak but couldn't. He shook Martinez's hand, holding it longer than necessary. Finally he managed, You saved my life. More than life. You saved my soul. Martinez squeezed his shoulder once, hard. You take care now. And Hans, when you get home, you tell them what you saw here. Tell them we're not what they said we were. I will, Hans promised. I swear it. As the truck rolled away, Hans looked back through the wooden slats. Martinez and his family stood waving from the porch, growing smaller with distance. The orange groves stretched behind them, endless and golden. Hans clutched the crate of oranges to his chest and made a silent promise. He would never forget what mercy looked like. The harbor was a graveyard of twisted metal and broken concrete. August 1945, the ship that brought Hans Miller back to Germany docked in Hamburg. Stepping onto the gangplank with his canvas bag and the crate of oranges, Hans entered a world unrecognizable as his homeland. Buildings that had once stood 5 stories tall were now jagged stumps. Refugees filled every available space. Children with hollow eyes watched the returning prisoners. Women in threadbare coats queued for water. He spent 2 days in Hamburg, then began the journey south to Bavaria. Now it took 2 weeks, walking when he could, hitching rides on military trucks, sleeping in bombed-out buildings. Every town looked the same: rubble and silence. When he finally reached his village, his heart was already prepared for the worst. He was not prepared enough. The house where he had grown up was gone. A crater marked where it had stood, filled with rainwater. The neighboring houses were collapsed shells. The church had no roof. His school was a pile of stone. Finding a neighbor living in her cellar, Hans asked the question he dreaded. His parents had perished in an air raid in 1944, the same month he had celebrated Christmas at the Martinez table. His sister had fled east and hadn't been heard from since. That night, Hans sat on the edge of the crater and opened the crate of oranges. He ate one slowly. His family had perished while he picked fruit in paradise. The guilt was crushing. But sitting there in the ruins, holding an orange from California, Hans understood that guilt could be transformed into purpose. Martinez had saved his life. Now he had to make that salvation mean something. His English made him valuable to the Allied occupation forces. Within a month, he found work as a translator. More importantly, the work connected him to agricultural reconstruction efforts. Hans became an unexpected bridge. He showed German farmers how to maximize yields and how to organize cooperative harvests. He carried Martinez's letter everywhere, showing it to anyone who doubted that an enemy soldier had been treated with dignity. The letter opened doors, changed minds, softened hearts. In the rubble of defeat, Hans became proof that kindness could survive even the cruelest wars. Hans, is that you? 1952. The train platform in Salinas, California. Hans Miller stepped down onto familiar ground, 7 years older, his hair touched with gray. And there stood Thomas Martinez, his hair silver, breaking into a smile as wide as the valley itself. Martinez held a wooden crate. Hans saw it from 50 feet away and began laughing through tears. Oranges. They embraced. When they finally stepped back, Martinez gestured to the truck. Got your house ready. Nothing fancy, but it's got a porch and a view of the groves. The letter had arrived in Hans's Munich apartment earlier that year. Inside was a photograph showing the Martinez family. And there, hanging on the Christmas tree, was the wooden angel Hans had carved 8 years earlier. The letter had been simple. Thomas needed a reliable foreman. The grove had expanded. Would Hans consider returning? He could sponsor the immigration papers. Germany remained haunted. When the letter arrived, he had read it 3 times, then written it back within a week. Yes. Martinez drove him to the grove, and as the familiar rows of orange trees came into view, Hans felt a weight lift. Peace. He worked as foreman for 5 years, then bought his own small grove, just 20 acres, but it was his. He planted trees, tended them with the care Martinez had taught him, and watched them bear fruit. Hans never married. When people asked why, he would say simply that he had already found his family. The Martinez daughters called him Uncle Hans. Their children called him Opa. He spent every Christmas at their table, watching as they hung his wooden angel in the same spot year after year. He also became a voice for reconciliation. Speaking at schools, at churches, at veterans' halls, Hans told his story plainly. How he had been taught to hate, and how a farmer with oranges had shown him a different way. How thousands of German prisoners had returned home with similar stories, carrying seeds of understanding that slowly changed how 2 nations saw each other. Historians would later recognize what men like Hans represented. The POW prisoner of war experience in America had created unexpected ambassadors. These men went home and told the truth that contradicted decades of propaganda. When Thomas Martinez passed in 1971, Hans spoke at the funeral and could barely finish. When Rosa followed in 1979, he planted an orange tree in her memory. When Hans Miller passed away in 1984 at the age of 69, his will contained a request that surprised no one. He wanted to be buried in Salinas, beneath the California sun, in the land that had taught him the true meaning of home. At his funeral, the Martinez family placed a single orange on his casket. The fruit that had once made a soldier weep now became a symbol of grace that transcended all borders. In the end, mercy had proven stronger than war, and kindness had outlasted every boundary drawn by fear. Sometimes the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields. They're earned in the quiet grace of an orange grove where enemies became neighbors and kindness proved stronger than propaganda. If this story moved you, please subscribe so we can keep uncovering these forgotten moments of humanity. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story of mercy and reconciliation, share it with them. Thanks for reading.